Back in December, I reviewed the RTX 4000 ADA Generation SFF card, and proclaimed it to be the fastest small form factor card in the world. But no sooner had the ink from that script dried than Gigabyte went ahead and launched the RTX 4060 Low Profile, a GPU that costs just 1/4 the price of the 4000 SFF. Well, I finally have my hands on one, so it's time to answer the question once and for all, what is the fastest small form factor graphics card in existence? And hopefully, the answer will stand for more than 2 months this time. Welcome back to Craft Computing, everyone. As always, I'm Jeff, and this is the Gigabyte WindForce RTX 4060 LP. And while it was announced all the way back in October of 2023, getting a hold of one proved to be nearly impossible. There were only a few review samples allocated from Gigabyte, and they seemed to be in very short supply even trying to purchase one at retail. That is, until earlier this month. I noticed Amazon and Newegg both had the 4060 LP in stock. So I reached out to my Gigabyte rep and requested one, and they were kind enough to send one over for this review. Like all reviews on this channel, no money changed hands, though Gigabyte has not told me if this sample will need to be returned to them yet. Gigabyte has no input over the production of this video, nor will they see it before it goes live on YouTube. I've always had a very soft spot for small form factor PCs. Over the years, I've built everything from the original shuttle PCs of the early 2000s to ITX boxes with off-the-shelf cases like my LAN rig here. And in the last couple years, I've put together two completely scratch-built ITX PCs. One made out of 3/8" steel plate, affectionately known as heavy metal, the other made from a parted-out Xbox One S that managed to fit an ITX motherboard, a 250-watt power supply, and an RTX A2000 small form factor GPU inside of its shell. While the RTX A2000 was a decent 1080p graphics card, in fact it's sitting right up here, I was still left wanting a little bit more. After all, the RTX A2000 was a $500 card, but it sat somewhere between the RTX 3050 and 3060 as far as performance was concerned. Good enough for 1080p and 60 FPS, but also not awe-inspiring. When the RTX 4000 ADA Generation SFF was announced, I knew it was the graphics card I'd been waiting for. Sure, it was $1,250, but given the only other option in this form factor were the A2000, an AMD RX 6400, or an Intel A380, it was pretty much the only move if you wanted more performance. In fact, while small form factor cards like these have always been around, I'm also having a hard time remembering the last time we got an NVIDIA 60 class GPU in this size. Sure, there were low-profile GTX 1050 and 1050 Ti cards. The 1650 also had a small form factor offering late in its cursed lifespan. There's also the RTX 3050 LP, but that literally launched 2 months ago in February of 2024. To say there's been a drought would be a massive understatement. A drought implies we've had high-performance GPUs in this form factor before. And I just don't know that that's the case. But the RTX 4060 is a proper desktop GPU in a very compact package. The GPU on the Gigabyte WindForce card is the same AD107 used in full RTX 4060s. We're looking at 3072 CUDA cores and 24 RT cores, along with 8 GB of GDDR6 memory. It has the same 1830 MHz base clock, and technically qualifies as an OC card, as its boost clock is rated a full 1 step faster than stock, at 2475 MHz instead of 2460. Now those specs still pale in comparison to the RTX 4000 ADA SFF. While it is based on the same Ada Lovelace architecture, the RTX 4000 SFF is rocking an AD104 GPU die. That's the same chip used in the RTX 4070 and 4080 class cards. With this GPU, we have basically double the raw specs of the RTX 4060, with 6,144 CUDA cores, 48 RT cores, and a full 20 GB of GDDR6 memory. The difference between these cards comes down to power design, as the 4000 SFF has just a 70-watt TDP versus 115 watts on the RTX 4060. The lower power target is achieved through lower clock speeds, with a base clock of just 720 MHz and a boost clock of 1560. There are a number of reasons for this reduced power draw. First, at 70 watts, the 4000 ADA SFF is bus powered, and doesn't require any ancillary PCIe power to run. This is also obviously not intended to be a gaming card, though that's exactly how we're going to judge it today. Instead, its massive CUDA core count is intended to be used as a small form factor AI accelerator, or in a low power workstation for CAD applications that require a high level of accuracy, or an even higher memory capacity. I was fully expecting to wind up with some crazy results when comparing these cards. The RTX 4060 only has 3000 CUDA cores, but crazy fast clock speeds. The 4000 SFF has double the raw hardware, but only 2/3 the power limit. Was I right in declaring the 4000 SFF the fastest low-profile card in the world before getting my hands on the 4060? Well, there's only one way to find out. The test bench for today should look fairly familiar if you've seen the last couple of my videos. This is my ITX LAN rig. We've got a 10729 ITX motherboard with an Intel 13900H engineering sample CPU and 32GB of DDR3600 memory. If you want to see a full review of this system, I will leave links to those videos down in the video description. I ran an equal number of synthetic and gaming benchmarks to try to suss out any differences in performance between these two cards, to see if there's a scenario where one GPU is dominantly faster than the other, and vice versa. What I wound up with was a definitive answer, but with some asterisks still very much attached to it. Starting with DirectX 11 in 3D Mark Firestrike, the 4000 SFF. You know what, I'm just going to call this the Quadro from here on out, because that's basically what this is. The Quadro manages a win by the slimmest of margins, with an overall score of 25,814 to 25,159, or a difference of just 2.6%. The graphics score was also 4% faster on the Quadro as well. Firestrike Ultra shows a much wider disparity between the cards, with the Quadro notching a double-digit win over the RTX 4060 with a score of 6,524 to 5,861. Moving on to TimeSpy and DirectX 12, the standard run shows very similar results to Firestrike standard, with the Quadro coming out around 2.5% faster than the 4060 in the overall score. TimeSpy Extreme, though, shows that the two GPUs are basically within a margin of error of each other, with only a few tenths separating them, at 4,944 from the Quadro versus 4,953 on the RTX 4060. One area I expected the Quadro to flat out dominate the RTX 4060 was in ray tracing, with double the RT cores. This should be much more efficient at both ray tracing and DLSS performance. And that theory kind of pans out in Port Royal, with the Quadro coming out 9% faster than the RTX 4060 LP. But it's not double the performance, and honestly, I'm a bit underwhelmed if I'm being honest. I know the Quadro isn't a gaming card, but this is the one test where the TDP limits of the 4000 SFF, I feel, are really holding it back. And finally, testing out DirectX 12 Ultimate, 3D Mark Speedway gave the RTX 4060 its first win of the day, though only by 1.8%, with a score of 2,610 to 2,563. When it comes to gaming, let's start off with Cyberpunk 2077 and make these cards work up a sweat. In a surprise to no one, neither card fared well at 1440p ultra settings, with RTX set to medium and DLSS disabled. But it was the RTX 4060 that came out on top, with an average of 20.4 frames per second and a low of 6.7. Both of those metrics are ahead of the Quadro, though they're also likely within a margin of error, as it's just 1 FPS less on average and a half of a frame on the low end of things. Adjusting down to RTX low settings and enabling DLSS in quality mode, both cards suddenly jump from slideshows to fully playable. The RTX 4060 manages 70 frames per second on average with a low of 35. The Quadro is around 2% faster on average at 71.5 frames per second, but the lows are around 5% worse. Typically, when reviewing graphics cards, anything within 5% of one another I chalk up as identical performance, because that's going to be the perception of you as the gamer. You're not going to be able to distinguish the differences between these two cards. While the Quadro was slightly faster overall, it also had slightly worse lows. I'm calling this one a tie, because it would be unfair to give the win to either of these GPUs. Moving from one game that had a lackluster release and absurdly high system requirements to the other, Starfield plays decently well on both graphics cards. Here at 1440p and high settings, and it's the Quadro with a 6% win, with an average of 49 frames per second to the 46.5 frames per second of the RTX 4060. But much like Cyberpunk, the average doesn't tell the whole story, as the Quadro struggled hard with the low frame rates, coming in at nearly 19% slower than the RTX 4060. When looking at these results, it is important to keep in mind that we are comparing two very dissimilar cards, despite being essentially the same architecture. Some games, and by extension some calculations, are more efficient with more GPU cores. Some require faster individual core speed, so both GPUs are going to perform better than the other, depending on the circumstances. With that in mind, Helldivers 2 is the weirdest benchmark of the day, highlighting those differences perfectly. At 1440p and high settings, the Quadro beats the RTX 4060 by almost 9%, averaging 84 frames per second versus 77. The lows, however, are abysmal by comparison. While the 4060 manages to keep even its 0.1% lows above 60 frames per second, the Quadro managed just half of that at 30.4, and made for a much more jittery experience. With nearly double the CUDA cores, the 4000 SFF should be the faster card in most scenarios, but in the case of Helldivers, something about this game didn't care how many cores the card had, and its overall lack of raw speed wound up hurting it in the end. Moving on to Doom Eternal and our one Vulkan benchmark for the day, the RTX 4060 manages a slight win, coming in at around 2.7% faster than the Quadro with an average of 192 FPS to 187. But unlike Helldivers, the Quadro actually managed better low frame times than its gaming-oriented sibling, albeit by, again, only about a 2% margin. Like in Cyberpunk, I'm going to call performance between these two cards equal. The metrics are nearly identical across the board, with an average frame rate of 187.2 and 192.3, you might be tempted to call a winner. After all, 5 frames per second is 5 frames per second, right? At those speeds though, that's a difference of just 0.14 milliseconds per frame. That's 6 extra frames every 200 frames. That's not enough for anyone to call out a measurable or noticeable difference. The results are identical. Now, thus far in these tests, there has been a trend developing, just not one that's easily spotted. Whichever card has won the average frame rate, it also loses both of the 1 and 0.1% lows. And in Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, we see much of the same. The RTX 4060 manages another narrow victory at 4%, with an average of 77.6 to the Quadro's 74.6. But the RTX 4060 also has worse 1 and 0.1% lows. If you want to call the Quadro up to 15% faster in the 0.1% lows here, I guess that's accurate. But again, a difference of only 2 FPS for a 0.1% low of all frames rendered in the game is not much of a difference. The average and 1% lows, again, are within 5%, making the user experience identical for all intents and purposes. Last but not least, there was one game that bucked the trend of the average and low frame times, and that was Wreckfest. This is a game that makes heavy use of GPU-accelerated physics, which is the bread and butter of CUDA cores. And it's no surprise that the Quadro came out on top by 7.4%, with an average of 202.7 frames per second to 189 on the RTX 4060. The 0.1% lows are identical between the two cards, but the Quadro does still manage to be 9% faster than the 4060 in the 1% lows, which means, for just the second time today, one of the GPUs has an outright victory to celebrate. So out of 7 gaming benchmarks and 6 synthetic tests, we have 9 ties, 1 win for the RTX 4060, and 3 wins for the 4000 ADA SFF. And 2 of those wins are directly conflicting with each other when it comes to ray tracing performance, with Cyberpunk playing better on ray tracing on the RTX 4060, and Port Royal running 9% faster on the 4000 SFF. So, straight up performance between these two cards, you can pretty much flip a coin, and even if you lose that coin flip, you're still likely going to be within 5% of the other GPU anyway. In more tests than not, the RTX 4000 ADA Generation SFF is faster than the RTX 4060 LP. But what about power draw and efficiency? Like I mentioned at the top of this video, these are 2 very different cards with 2 very different power requirements. The RTX 4060 LP has a 115 watt TDP versus just 70 watts on the Quadro. But what does that mean in the real world? To give one final metric for both cards, I ran 3D Mark Time Spy's stress test on a loop and waited for the GPU temperature to normalize. Then I set a 10-minute timer. At the end of 10 minutes, I recorded the average clock speed, temperature, and power draw from hardware info, as well as the average, low, and high power draw measured from the wall via a kilowatt. During that stress test, the RTX 4060 averaged 112.5 watts of power, with a GPU clock speed of 2,616 MHz. Meanwhile, the low-power 4000 SFF drew just 68.8 watts on average and maintained a clock speed of 1,575 MHz. Shockingly enough, that's actually above its advertised boost speed of 1560 MHz, which typically isn't allowed on workstation cards like this. As far as total system power, the RTX 4060 drew about 185 watts on average, with a low reading of 157 and a high of 237 watts. And here's where the RTX 4000 ADA really smoked the low-profile gaming card, with an average power draw of 153 watts from the wall, a low reading of 137, and a high reading of just 167 watts. From an average power draw perspective, measured from the wall, that's a difference of about 34 watts on average, in favor of the 4000 SFF. But running this through an electricity calculator, it's never going to be worth the difference in price between the two cards. If you game for 3 hours a day, even if your electricity is 50 cents per kilowatt hour, the difference in power use between these two cards is just $18.63 per year. Even if you ran these cards 24/7, 365, an entire year's worth of folding at home, that's just $149.02 savings per year by buying the 4000 SFF instead of the RTX 4060. But this card costs almost $1,000 more. So I guess if you planned on buying one of these and then running it for 8 years, 24/7, this would eventually pay for itself. Now, I'm sure some people down in the comments are going to argue that the RTX 4000 SFF does have 20 gigabytes of VRAM versus just 8 gigabytes on the RTX 4060. But in my testing today, even Cyberpunk at 1440p, ultra settings, ray tracing enabled, that wasn't enough to saturate all 8 gigabytes on the 4060. Doom at Ultra Nightmare actually drew the most VRAM use at 7 gigabytes, where most of the other games were happy to sit at 6 gigabytes or even less. Unless you're gaming at 4K, ultra settings, ray tracing fully enabled, 8 gigabytes is still enough for you today. And if you're gaming at those settings, you're also not playing on an RTX 4060. In the end, this conclusion shouldn't surprise anyone. The NVIDIA RTX 4000 ADA Generation SFF is still the world's fastest small form factor GPU, but only by a couple percentage points, and it does get upset by the RTX 4060 depending on your workload. But at the end of the day, if gaming is your goal, the benchmarks here should prove that to the end user, there's no perceptible difference between the 4000 SFF and the $319 Gigabyte RTX 4060 LP. I'm also likely the only person crazy enough to put these two cards in a test head-to-head against each other. What are some other weird GPUs you'd like to see run down in a head-to-head competition? Let me know down in the comments below. On your way down there, make sure to drop this video a like and subscribe to Craft Computing if you haven't done so already. And if you like the content you see on this channel and want to see crazy comparisons and reviews like this, head on over to craftcomputing.store and pick yourself up one of our nucleated pint glasses, my beer installation floppy disk coasters, or we just started carrying minimalist wallets. So if you want to be like Maurice Moss in Pulp Fiction, you too can be a bad mother flipper. That's going to do it for me in this one. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next video. I'd clink glasses, but I don't like this one. Cheers, everyone. Beer for today is another one from Pfriem, and I think I incorrectly said Portland last time. I always get this one wrong. Pfriem is in Hood River, Oregon. Apologies to Hood River. This is their Belgian-Style Blonde Ale, clocking in at 7.5%. This one seems to be super carbonated, and that nucleated glass is doing some work. All right, this one might be a little difficult to pour. There we go. So far, I'm not enjoying this. Now that is one good-looking pour. A sip of Pfriem Belgian-Style Blonde Ale begins with notes of pear and cloves before segueing into a clean maltiness and ending with just enough bitterness to make you yearn for that first sip again. I think there's something wrong with my beer. This tastes like a wild ale. It is, it tastes like a farmhouse. It tastes tangy. Smells exactly like a farmhouse ale as well. I think something went on with the yeast in this batch. I've had this ale before from Pfriem, and normally I'm a huge fan. This is not their normal Belgian-style blonde. I get a little clove. Clove is the only recognizable flavor outside of skunk and 2-day-old wet chopped grass. Don't get me wrong, I'm a huge fan of Belgians. I'm not a huge fan of farmhouse. That's more farmhouse than Belgian. Way more. do not like.